We all know W.B. Yeats, lofty poet, bard of the nation, unrequited lover. What we weren't told at school, however, is that he was a particularly human soul, obsessed all his life with sex and the occult, a stark contrast to the poet who helped inspire the idea of a nation and its culture. Yeats's life encompassed farce as well as verse, and many think his work was all the better for it. "You were silly like us, your gift survived it all," wrote W.H. Auden of Yeats. Like us, he lived a life of folly and desire. Perhaps it's time to look for the man behind the poetic mask.
I think the phrase that is most significant is his setting down of the notion of myself I must remake.
Have you noticed that Yeats is an anagram of yeast, and that both have the property of turning the base into the precious?
Like some alchemist, Yeats transformed the base stuff of his life into the gold of poetry. And like the best of magicians, his final act may have been to disappear altogether. Before his death in France in 1939, W.B. Yeats wrote his funeral arrangements in verse, commanding publicly that he be buried in Sligo.
Under bare Ben Bulben's head, in Drumcliff churchyard, Yeats is laid. An ancestor was rector there long years ago. A church stands near.
But Yeats could not command history. The outbreak of war in 1939 made it impossible for Yeats's body to be brought home. It was only in 1948, 9 years after his death, that Ireland could finally bring home its poet of the nation.
Earth receive an honoured guest, William Yeats is laid to rest. Let the Irish vessel lie, emptied of its poetry.
But true to form, behind the curtain of the international stage lay a more human story concerning the whereabouts of Yeats's remains.
The saga of what happened to Yeats's body after he was buried is still uncertain and slightly contested.
Louise Foxcroft has her own connections to the mystery of Yeats's body. In 1939, her granduncle was buried in the plot next to Yeats's grave.
The first one appears to be it's a list of deaths. I don't know if it's from the parish register. It's got Yeats, William Butler, aged 72. This is 1939. And he's buried in level E, or carré A. And then 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 down is Alfred Hollis, who's my great-uncle, died aged 44 on the 11th of February, buried on the same level as Yeats. I think they realised that they'd got W.B. Yeats somewhere and they didn't know where he was. On this page, this gets quite interesting. These officials are placing him in another coffin to be transported down to the Irish corvette to be taken away under escort, armed escort. I visited Drumcliff about 7 years ago with a cousin of mine, and then we felt we were visiting Alfred's grave. That's what it felt like.
Perhaps Yeats, now a god of literature, looked down upon his own state funeral. While he lived, he could never escape his body, its desires and frailties. It kept posing questions of him. Maybe it's fitting it leaves us with a question, decades after he died.
In the early years, I couldn't understand Yeats at all. He seemed to have been taken by the fairies, and it didn't seem to resemble the Ireland which I was beginning to understand. I thought he was a living monument, and I had to respect the monument, but I didn't really feel close to him.
First experience of him would have been in school, secondary school, the usual. He's getting forced down your throat type of thing. but I liked him, you know. But then after secondary school, I didn't have really that much of a relationship with poetry, and especially not with Yeats, you know. I mean, he was on the money, and that was about it. Like, I didn't really have much to do with him other than that.
In a sense, I think Yeats's image and identity for his reading public was formed very early by what we would now think of as the Celtic Twilight poetry.
I am going to begin with a poem of mine called The Lake Isle of Innisfree, because if you know anything about me, you will expect me to begin with it.
The fact that Innisfree kept coming back to haunt him, the fact that it was what people asked for, the fact that it was, you know, always the signature poem, drove him mad.
I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made.
Had he stopped writing in 1900 or 1910, he would still be remembered for what are the anthology poems, and they're anthology poems for a reason.
September 1913, it just feels so relevant right now, you know. You look around and you see where we are now and how kind of sullied we'd all become by grade and what happened with the Celtic Tiger. And we all kind of were re-experiencing that and assessing ourselves through the prism of 1913, you know. So it's still very relevant to me anyway.
What needs you in a cool sense and fumbling a greasy till and add the halfpence to the pence and rare to shivering rare. You drive them arrow from the bone, for men were born to pray and save. Romantic Ireland, it's dead and gone. It's with O'Leary and in the grave.
When I reread it, it shocked me how relevant it was, and that kind of annoyed me. It annoyed me that our society hasn't moved on and developed. It annoyed me that a writer that is dead as long as he is could still have his finger in the pulse, but that's, I suppose, part of his genius really, isn't it?
Romantic Ireland may have died tragically young for Yeats, smothered by materialism, but he kept her spirit alive in another woman.
When you are old and grey and full of sleep, and nodding by the fire, take down this book and slowly read, and dream of the soft look your eyes had once, and of their shadows deep.
The early love poems are justly famous for their innocent romance. Indeed, Yeats remained a virgin until he was 30. He confessed in print that his desires left him in a state of nervous exhaustion from which he sought relief in vain. As a result, the demure poet became a figure of fun in some Dublin circles. When the English co-founder of the Abbey Theatre, Annie Horniman, fell for Yeats, a limerick circulated in the bars of the city.
What a pity that Miss Annie Horniman, when she wants to seduce or suborn a man, she should choose Willie Yeats, who still masturbates, and at any rate isn't a horny man.
What the smirking drinkers weren't to know was that the subject of sexuality would trouble and, lucky for us, inspire Yeats for the rest of his life.
I was 20 and Willie was 21 when we first met, and he was extremely proud of that 1 year's seniority. He looked much younger than I did because he was rather a disheveled art student, for he intended to be a painter like his father.
I was brought by my actor friend, and he brought me around to see her, and I found I was speaking to somebody playing a part. I thought she was an actress. Her voice was much more English, a very fine voice, and she rejoiced in her own myth, and I found that harder to take. I mean, she was a living myth, she was a part of history, and she knew it.
Yeats was in the business of making myths, of himself, of others, and of Ireland. He fashioned Maud Gonne into the goddess of unrequited love, but the truth is that there was always another woman in his life, Ireland herself.
At every stage of his life, the matter of Ireland and the destiny of the country and the quality of culture in the country the quality of politics in the country, all concerned him.
He merged his two loves when he cast Maud as Kathleen Ni Houlihan in the play of that name. Both chaste, spiritual, unattainable creatures. But while Yeats was busy wooing his image of an ideal Ireland, history was being consummated in the street.
The 1916 Rising came as a great surprise to Yeats, as it did to many others. He could hardly believe it. He felt, and he writes, that nothing is now certain about the future except that it cannot be anything like the past.
Yeats privately recoiled from the fanaticism he had started to see in Maud Gonne and men like Pearse, who he called half-cracked. But in his most famous political poem, he accepted that they had been transfigured by history.
To murmur name upon name, as a mother names her child, when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? No, no, not night, but death.
In Easter 1916, Yeats put aside his personal prejudices for the greater cause. Yeats had believed allegations made about Maud Gonne's former husband, Major John McBride, of domestic violence against her and the molestation of her then 11-year-old daughter, Iseult Gonne. Yet, McBride takes his place among the heroes of the poem.
This other man I had dreamed a drunken, vainglorious lout. He had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart. Yet I number him in the song. He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly. A terrible beauty is born.
In the same year as the Rising, Yeats was facing his own personal crisis. He was 52 and still alone. He turned to a belief system that was to be taboo in the new Ireland, the occult.
Yeats, all his life, believed that by intellectual and spiritual concentration could elevate your consciousness to a level where you could access things, ideas, worlds which were not normally accessible.
He early got interested in Asian thought in the 1880s and founded a Hermetic Society in Dublin, and it was affiliated with the Theosophical Society, and then left them partially because he wanted to do more exploring than they would. And so he joined a magical order and was a very serious mage in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn.
There's a famous early letter of Yeats's to his mentor, John O'Leary, defending Yeats's magical experimentation and searches. He says that the world of magic is at the center of everything I think and do and write, and I could not have written the poems which you, O'Leary, admire without that sense of a magical dimension.
Such was Yeats's belief in magic. He was fully prepared to let his life be guided by it. Through the secretive cult, the Golden Dawn, Yeats had an astrological chart drawn up. It produced for him a deadline by which to become a husband and father.
1917 was going to be the most propitious year for him to get married. And so he needed to make it happen if it was going to make it happen. But also, I think he had turned 50. He was feeling the need for family, children, posterity, in a physical as well as intellectual sense. A book was not going to be enough.
Yeats now returned to familiar territory. Much has been written about the sexless relationship between Yeats and Maud Gonne. In reality, they consummated the affair a number of times. But the poet did not want to disturb the image of the tragic lover and the chaste queen.
The first of all the tribe lay there, and did such pleasure take, she who had brought great Hector down, and put all Troy to wreck, that she cried into his ear, strike me if I shriek.
When a final and predictable refusal of marriage came from Maud, the poet turned his attentions to her 22-year-old daughter, Isolde. Yeats had become infatuated with her, even though for much of her life he had been a surrogate father to her. Isolde also refused marriage. If Yeats had made a fool of himself, he didn't seem to care. His attention now turned to 24-year-old Georgia Hyde Lees. George, as he was to call her, had been drawn to the Golden Dawn with its frisson of illicit pagan rites.
He initiated her in 1914. So she was a very good astrologer and very knowledgeable in the history of the occult, and brought a lot of her own knowledge and reading into the relationship.
In keeping with his own astrological deadline, W.B. Yeats married Georgia Hyde Lees in 1917. Far from naive, George would bring something so unexpected to the union that it would change his personal and creative life forever.
A marriage that begins in the most extraordinary and unlikely and ill-omened way. He marries very quickly in a state of near panic, having proposed to and been refused by Isolde Gaunt, about whom he remains obsessed. He marries a woman nearly as young as her, whom he does not know very well, and who on their honeymoon in the Ashdown forest is convinced, practically as he is becoming convinced, that this has all been a terrible mistake.
There wasn't much action on the honeymoon, and she began, Georgie, as he called her, began to get impatient. And then she got, as I say in my book, and it struck me, the most ingenious device a wife ever invented to wake the interest of a bored husband.
George unhappily discovered that Yeats had written to Isolde during their honeymoon. There had been no physical intimacy yet between the couple. She began to channel the spirit world to her new husband as if she were a medium, and that afternoon the marriage was consummated.
She began automatic writing, and he did believe the spirits from the other world were flowing out through her hand and writing these words for him to use in metaphors for his poetry.
The minute that stuff started happening, everything changed. I think really everything changed. He became completely entranced, obsessed by it, And they started realizing that something was coming that was systematic and that was a new way of looking at the world through these symbols. And of course, Yeats loved symbols, and that these were going to be symbols he could use not only philosophically but also poetically. Gratitude to the unknown instructors. What they undertook to do, they brought to pass. All things hang like a drop of dew upon a blade of grass.
He'd begun to think about Maud Gonne and Isolde again. So it was one of the greatest matrimonial strokes in literary history.
We may smile at the idea of Yeats and George being involved in the Ouija board or the medium or the voices from beyond, from the other side. But you know what? As far as I can see, all poetry partakes somewhat of that idea.
Over 3 years of intense automatic writing sessions followed. George filled thousands of pages that would provide Yeats with symbols and metaphors for some of his greatest work, including one of the most potent and visionary poems of the 20th century.
The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight.
I just love the sort of subtle panic in the poem, and the symbolism of it, where it's like he mightn't actually be saying enough, but it's just ambiguous enough to sort of be disturbing, that way. And it kind of, what's mad, the potency of the poem is in those kind of, where he's plumbing the depths of his own subconscious and the human subconscious, and we all kind of know what he's talking about. but we don't, you know, and I think that's the power of the poem.
Turning and turning in the widening jar, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed. And everywhere, the ceremony of innocence is drawn.
Joyce said that the thing Yeats had, and that he, Joyce, didn't have, was a power of imagination that was unequaled. No surrealist poet can equal it, Joyce said. I think there's a lot in that. And you'll get it in poems that produce an image from his wide reading, from his occult researches, and make it a concrete, and even bring it into a contemporary political context. And that's where a lot of the impact of some of the most famous poems comes from.
The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand.
He did think something terrible might be coming. But he also thought that would be its cycle, and then something else would come after that. The rough beast coming round again.
The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, it's all come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born.
Out of an obsession with the mystical arts that some would deem foolish, Yeats gleaned images that spoke of the modern world and that continue to resonate. Once again, out of the base, he had forged the precious. Yeats once described his own art as an accident in the search for reality. His marriage at the age of 52 to George and their experimentations in the occult had opened a new world for the poet to explore.
She just found just the way to inspire him. He was always a great poet, even back to his early days, but the final years were the greatest, and much thanks to her.
She was dauntingly intelligent. I mean, I think this stuff captured him, but it also captured her attention. And thus declared that Arab lady, "Last night, where under the wild moon on grassy mattress I had laid me, within my arms great Solomon, I suddenly cried out in a strange tongue, not his, not mine."
A lot of these exchanges are about sex, in fact, and about the sexual fulfillment, together with spiritual searching, which will make their marriage a unit.
And when at last that murder's over, maybe the bride bed brings despair, for each an imagined image brings and finds a real image there. Yet the world ends when these two things, though several, are a single light, when oil and wick are burned in one. Therefore a blessed moon last night gave Sheba to her Solomon. Part of the Yeats that we know is a production made by George Yeats. I sort of got the suspicion after a while looking at all these manuscripts that she married him in part because she didn't want to be bored, you know, and she thought somebody else might just not be interesting enough to be married to. And they created a relationship that was a very homey and good relationship out of this very strange beginning.
As the automatic writing sessions progressed, George also began to take more control. The instructors were now laying the groundwork for the couple to conceive children. Within 2 years, their daughter Anne and son Michael were born. For most of his life, Yeats had lived between Ireland and England, but the Irish Revolution led to a new commitment. Yeats dedicated himself to the nation and a consciously public role in it. In 1919, he moved the family to the tower he had bought in County Galway. Characteristically, it afforded him a lofty view of the country. Others described it as his phallic symbol in the bog.
He had to be absolutely alone. So completely alone that even when an infant was in the room and silent, he had still to be alone because no personality must be there at all. It wasn't a matter of merely being spoken to or interrupted or anything else, but it had been absolute isolation in a room wherever he was writing.
I have walked and prayed for this young child an hour, and heard the sea wind scream upon the tower and under the arches of the bridge, and scream in the elms above the flooded stream, imagining in excited reverie that the future years had come, dancing to a frenzied drum out of the murderous innocence of the sea.
In A Prayer for My Daughter, Yeats returned to his fearful prophecy that the world was descending into anarchy. But it was the actual brutality and violence of the civil war playing out around his home that provoked Yeats to respond uniquely to the contradictions of revolution.
There's a piece in Meditations in Time of Civil War, a section called The Stairs Nest at My Window. And it's about, in the midst of all this, actual shooting around the tower, this bird is building its nest, and the bees are building in the crevices of the masonry.
The bees build in the crevices of loosening masonry, and there the mother birds bring grubs and flies. My wall is loosening. Honey bees, come build in the empty house of the stair.
It's very tender for Yeats. Not really a poet of tenderness, usually. It's very vulnerable and sweet and a sense of endangered life.
A barricade of stone or of wood, some 14 days of civil war. Last night they trundled down the road, the dead young soldier in his blood. Come build in the empty house of the stair.
With the Civil War now over, the poet took a direct hand in trying to build the nation. His role in the new state as a senator and his contribution to the cultural life of Ireland was recognised by the awarding of the Nobel Prize.
He came to the phone himself. He didn't know the news. And I said, this is a great honour not only for you, but for the country. And I could see he was getting slightly, even over the telephone, slightly impatient of what it was all about. So I said, you've been awarded the Nobel Prize. A very great honour to you and a very great honour to Ireland. And to my amazement, the first question, the only question he asked was, how much, Smiley, how much is it?
If you see him in pieces of documentary film, little clips, he's got the top hat on or whatever, the image of him, which he cultivated as the aloof, self-absorbed, almost unworldly presence, it gave him a freedom to observe, as it were, from behind this mask, as he would have called it.
However, Yeats was coming to know an Ireland that he didn't like: conservative, Catholic, and materialist. He was beginning to publicly turn his face away from his oldest love. The Tower, published in 1928, was an intense personal testimony, an attack on the poet himself and the world that now revered him. Yeats would tear down the image of the smiling public man. In 1928, at the age of 63, Yeats was to discover perhaps his greatest theme, the tragedy of a raging spirit trapped in the body of an old man.
The sense of development all the time, the intellectual, artistic, creative energy that comes pouring out of him, even after very serious illnesses, like in the late 20s, is quite extraordinary.
The first poem of Yeats's I knew by heart was Sailing to Byzantium, which is a great poem of life and death.
That is no country for old men. The young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations.
The first stanza has got this terrific sense of the salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh and fowl, the terrific vitality and surge in it.
An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing.
It ends up with him out of nature, imagining himself singing in a golden bird, but singing of what is past or passing or to come. And throughout that book, The Tower, there's a sense of the frailty, not only of human life, but of human civilization.
Yeats now rebelled against the injustice of nature itself, that an old man was still provoked by desire, but denied its experience.
How can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And how can body, laid in that white rush, but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead.
He's really unafraid as a poet. He's unafraid to do things that other people would find in bad taste, and he just goes there anyway.
Whence did all that fury come? From empty tomb or virgin womb? Saint Joseph thought the world would melt, but like the way his fingers smelt.
Couldn't be more different from what the dominant church of the Ireland of his day is saying about sex. And this, of course, has to be factored in to why it's the early poems that appear on the Inter Cert and Leaving Cert, and why so many of the obituaries after he dies strike a very pious and regretful note about, how could the man who wrote Down by the Sally Gardens and all the rest of it have ended up by writing this. The word filth was actually used, certainly privately, if not publicly.
Kathleen Ní Houlihan had been ditched for Crazy Jane, a foul-mouthed, dirty old woman. While De Valera and the nation listened to Count John McCormack singing Panis Angelicus, Yeats was turning to the fallen angels of the peasantry and their bawdy songs.
I met the bishop on the road, and much said he and I. Those breasts are flat and fallen now. Those veins must soon run dry. Live in a heavenly mansion and not in some foul sty.
She partially exists just to flaunt something in the faces of the censors. She's an old woman who proclaims loudly to anybody who wants to listen, and even those who don't, that old women too have sexual desires and
A woman can be proud and stiff when on love intent, but love has pitched his mansion in the place of excrement. For nothing can be soul or whole that has not been rent.
We remember, among so many other things, Yeats's line about sex and the dead being the only two fit subjects for the rational mind, or I think it was for the thinking mind. I can't remember what the rest of it is. Who cares what the rest of it is? Sex and the dead.
But Yeats had a problem for someone who would devote his life to thinking about, writing about, and engaging in sex. In terms of desire, he was about to enter what he would call his second puberty. Physically, he was an old man.
He was convinced that creativity and sexual potency were connected, and that he needed to keep himself vivid by keeping himself sexually engaged.
In 1934, at the age of 68, Yeats underwent a new surgical procedure, the Steinach operation. Although in today's terms, little more than a vasectomy, at the time it was believed to rejuvenate the potency of elderly patients. After the operation, Yeats said that he wanted to make up for what he termed the wasted nights of his youth.
One can trivialise this. One can sneer at it, as I think many of his Dublin contemporaries did, but one must also see it as a powerful voltage in his work.
His wife George said the operation to restore his vigour was unsuccessful, but as one writer said, she may not have been the best judge. One thing is certain, Yeats's creative potency was to flourish. A string of relationships with younger women quickly followed the operation, including one with Margot Ruddock, an unpublished poet, and with the successful young writer Edith Mannan. Even more important relationships would follow.
I don't think that George worried that these other relationships would replace the one that he had with her. I don't think she was really jealous, which is kind of a mystery to me, but I think it's true.
There were two aristocratic women who became intrinsic to Yeats's life. In 1935, he had fallen in love with the poet Dorothy Wellesley, whose work he greatly admired. A year later, journalist Edith Shackleton Heald came into Yeats's life. He had always been drawn to the levelled lawns of these wealthy hostesses. Within those English houses, his writing continued unrestrained.
You think it horrible that lust and rage should dance attendance upon my old age. They were not such a plague when I was young. What else have I to spur me into song?
He would come with a germ of something, you see, in his mind, and then work it out. He used to work aloud quite a lot. He had a beautiful, deep voice. One could hear him beating out the rhythm of the poems while he was composing them, when he was working in his room upstairs.
While George kept the family home back in Dublin, Yeats spent months at a time with the other two women in his life.
She is always there as the partner in his life, not in, I think, a kind of passive or doormat way, but in a very real sense of partnership, and who is endlessly understanding of what he needs in terms of generation, self-generation, generation through infatuations or passions for others.
In his last 5 years, Yeats wrote more poems than during the entire decade of the 20s. But with failing health, he had been ordered by his doctors to the south of France. Facing his final winter, Yeats was fully aware of his own mortality.
An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a cloak, unless soul will clap his hands and sing, and louder sing for every tatter of his mortal dress. Nor have I found singing school, but monument to its own magnificence. Well, I think that's great stuff, especially at my age. I'm 83. I won't say I think about death every day, but it crosses my horizon now and again.
When it came to his own mortality, I think he wasn't that daunted. Sound of a stick upon the floor, a sound of somebody who moves from chair to chair.
Sound of a stick upon the floor, a sound that somebody that toils from chair to chair. Beloved books that famous hands have bound.
The sound of him he makes, it's like cut in stone. He said he wanted a passionate syntax, and the tremble in his voice and also the forward movement of the argument is just irresistible, I think.
Where none has reigned but lacked the name.
The last poems that were published after his death, though they shocked and surprised people, we can now see as some of his greatest works. Above all, out of which comes a sense of understanding the extraordinary journey of his own life.
I mean, one thinks of the circus animal's desertion, this great, the great sweep of that poem in terms of its autobiographical impulses, but it does end up with, you know, a vision of the poet coming towards the end of his life. Those masterful images, because complete, grew in pure mind, but out of what began? A mound of refuse, or the sweepings of a street, old kettles, old bottles, and a broken can, old iron, old bones, old rags, that raving slut who keeps the till. Now that my ladder's gone, I must lie down where all the ladders start, in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart.
And then he's getting ready for leaving the earth, and I keep saying how absolutely marvelous it was that Yeats was able to make coincide the end of his physical life, his life on earth, and the end of his artistic life, because on his deathbed he was writing poems.
How can I, that girl standing there, my attention fix on Roman or on Russian or on Spanish politics? Yet here's a travel man that knows what he talks about, and there's a politician that has both read and thought. And maybe what they say is true of war and war's alarms. But oh, that I were young again and held her in my arms.
Irish poets, earn your trade, sing whatever is well made, scorn the sorts now grown up, all out of shape from toe to top. Their unremembering hearts and heads, base-born products of base beds. Sing the peasantry and then hard-riding country gentlemen, the holiness of monks and after, porter drinkers, randy laughter. Sing the lords and ladies gay that were beaten into the clay. Through 7 heroic centuries, cast your mind on other days, that we, in coming days, may be still the indomitable Irishery.
During the last days of his life, Yeats was surrounded by the women who loved him most. In a selfless act, George had invited Dorothy and Edith to come to his bedside in France, as she said, to help light the flame. The scene was almost a reenactment of one of Yeats's Cuchulainn plays.
Come hither. Come, sit beside the bed. You need not be afraid, for I myself sent for you, Ethna in Guba. Of all the people in the world, we two, and we alone, may watch together here, because we have loved him best.
By the time I arrived, he was really very ill, and he died 2 days later. It was on the night he died. I'd watched over him for half the night, and Mrs. Yeats brought me his fountain pen that he'd used for many years, and his pocket dictionary that always travelled with him as keepsakes.
One of the jaw-droppers is that he died, shall we say, on a Saturday. And nobody rang Dublin until Sunday, and they rang Jack. And Jack gets on his bike and rides round to his sister's and knocks at the door, and what he does is he just opens his arms and says, "Gone."
Yeats and George had often discussed his death. According to George, his actual words were, "If I die, bury me up there at Rockbroom, and then in a year's time, when the newspapers have forgotten me, dig me up and plant me in Sligo." W.H. Auden may have been closer to the actual truth when he wrote of Yeats entering posterity. He disappeared in the dead of winter. Now he is scattered among 100 cities.
The saga of what happened to Yeats's body after he was buried is still uncertain and slightly contested. He was buried in Rockbroom Cemetery. His wife took, as people did in these small rocky cemeteries without much room, a lease effectively on the grave. This, you must remember, was 1939. She expected him to be disinterred and brought back to Sligo at a later point. The Second World War intervened.
In the aftermath of World War II, Edith Shackleton Heald returned to visit the ghost of her famous lover. She had stood at the graveside 8 years previously, but now, to her horror, Yeats's grave was gone. What appears to have happened is that during the war, many bodies had been moved to the cemetery's ossuary, where skeletons were stored, to make room for the Italian war dead. In 1948, when an article in the Times reported that the body of Yeats was to be brought home to Ireland, Edith questioned how sure the family could be of finding the body of Yeats. And the same question would weigh on the minds of the family of Alfred Hollis, the Englishman who'd been buried next to Yeats in 1939.
There's been quite a lot of upset and disturbance for everybody over the last 60, 70 years now. And of course, it's not just my family, it's Yeats' family as well, and there's been quite a lot of upset and disturbance for everybody over the... I think this is it. I can see the mortuary chapel and the ledge here where the terrace steps down. I mean, there's not much that's still here, but that's still there, so I think we can locate it quite precisely. It's Yeats' grave and my great-uncle's grave here, I think. Alfred was in his mid-40s, but he had TB and he was severely disabled by it. He was very weak, and he came down in 1939 for, well, obviously for the climate and the cure, and they died here within a couple of days of each other and then were buried next to each other. Just after the war finished, my grandparents came back with my mother, who was then 17, and her sister, Coral, and they came to look for the graves, and they'd completely gone. And this was a major surprise. They had no idea of what was going on. But during the wartime, they went to the abbé, the local priest, and they went to the town hall to try and discover what had happened. And they were told that because of the fighting that took place around here, and because of the records had been destroyed, nobody knew what had happened to the bodies. My grandparents just left it at that and thought, well, that's one of the casualties of war, that's just another war story. And they went home, and then in 1948, a year later, my grandfather read in the Times a piece about the Yeats family having traced Yeats's body and were bringing it back for a funeral in Sligo. And of course, my grandfather was a bit, confused and surprised, and couldn't understand how this grave had been discovered and this one hadn't. So he wrote to Michael Yeats, and W.B.'s son replied, "The position with regard to the cemetery at Rockbroom would appear to be more than a little confused. As far as the remains of my father are concerned, they've been traced and are now lying in a vault, ready to be taken home as soon as transport can be arranged. I'm very sorry I cannot be more informative about this matter, but I have very little direct knowledge of conditions in Roquebrune. The whole matter was dealt with for us by the French authorities in Paris, through the French legation in Ireland, and there was no occasion for me to travel to Roquebrune." My grandfather, who was a bit of a tenacious chap, he decided to dig further, and they discovered that the French doctor who had identified what they believed to be Yeats' bodies had used the presence of a corset, which was made of leather and steel strips. And That was a corset that Alfred had worn because he'd got curvature of the spine through his TB. Now, W.B. Yeats had worn a truss for a hernia problem, which of course is quite a different and less substantial contraption. So my grandfather then was fairly convinced that they'd got the wrong body. This story's cropped up again and again, and occasionally the journalists come back and, you know, have a look. I visited Drumcliff about 7 years ago with a cousin of mine. So if he's there, I've been to visit him, and if he's here, I've been to visit him.
Whatever the whereabouts of the body, the Irish government was determined to reclaim W.B. Yeats. It was a symbolic homecoming. The newly formed Irish Navy was sent out on its first operation to fetch home the remains of the poet of the nation.
Everything he wrote was read. After certain years, he won sufficient money for his need. Friends that have been friends indeed. What then, sang Plato's Ghost? What then?
In a fitting end, the official in charge of bringing Yeats home was the Minister of External Affairs, Sean MacBride, the son of Maud Gonne. De Valera attended the funeral, and Ireland reclaimed the body. The irony of the homecoming would not have been lost on Yeats. And so Ireland created a myth of the poet that as a nation we would come to know as if etched in stone. A strange memorial for a man so passionately in love with life and death and love itself.
On limestone quarried near the spot, by his command, these words are cut. Cast a cold eye on life, on death. Horsemen, pass by.
You know, one of the things that I like about that is that it's a quatrain without a last line. It announces something to the passers-by, but it also quite obviously leaves something out. And I think that's interesting. I think one of the reasons that Yeats is a powerful poet is that he doesn't tell us everything that we need to know. He demands that we do some of the work. And that tombstone does that. Is he telling you to pass by, or is he telling you to stop and think?
The work is done, grown old, he thought, according to my boyish plan. Let the fools rage, I swerved in naught, something to perfection brought. But louder sang that ghost, what then?
I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight I do not hate, those that I guard I do not love. My country is cold-hearted and crust, my countrymen cold-hearted and poor. No likely end could bring them loss, or lead them happier than before. Nor law nor duty bade me fight, nor public men nor cheering crowds. A lonely impulse of delight drove this tumult in the clouds. I balanced over all to mind, the years to come seemed waste of breath. A waste of breath the years behind, in balance with this life, this death.